In 1993, comedic magician duo Penn and Teller began work on a video game, a collection of practical joke mini-games called Smoke and Mirrors. The game's producers, Absolute Entertainment, went out of business before the game could be released, but copies found their way out into the world. And the game has subsequently become infamous in online circles for a minigame called Desert Bus, which has players driving a bus on a straight highway from Tucson to Las Vegas. There are no other cars or activities, you do not pick anyone up, and the road never curves. The bus can only go 45 miles an hour, and it veers slightly to the right, requiring players to provide constant attention. The game is performed in real time, and takes 8 hours to complete. When you arrive at your destination, the game gives you 1 point, and resets for you to make the return trip. I thought a lot about Desert Bus while diving into the details of today's subject. Spirit of Speed 1937 looks to simulate the experience of 1930s motorsports. As the back of the box says, driving the most exciting cars ever built, and experiencing the thrill of total speed, citing a series of individual cars which each have their own handling characteristics, emphasizing that some of them are more difficult than others, which is interesting. I've always been obsessed with period specifics in recreation, using my resources to delve into the media and put myself in the headspace of someone who lived in another time. And it's something that has fascinated me over my lifetime. So I am, hypothetically, something of a target audience here, inherently primed and ready for a game like Spirit of Speed 1937 to really thrill me. But also, coming into this project, I was already somewhat familiar with Spirit of Speed 1937, because Spirit of Speed 1937 has a reputation. While doing my research for this project generally, this game came up again and again in Dreamcast circles as one of the absolute dirt worst releases for the system. Stone cold F grades left and right. Rather infamously, it was a game that is listed as being released by LJN, a notorious publisher of god-awful shovelware sludge. But the thing about this being released by LJN is that LJN became defunct as a company in 1994, and Spirit of Speed dropped on the Dreamcast in the summer of the year 2000. LJN had not had their infamous rainbow logo on a single thing in 6 years, so I had to start digging to figure out who was really behind this. The British television production company Broadsword, most famous for the late 80s, early 90s UK kids game show Nightmare, which, if you're not familiar, is sort of like if the final green screen round of Nick Arcade was the entire competition, founded an offshoot called Broadsword Interactive, and dipped their first toe into game production with a successful pitch to veteran developer Microprose, a company famed for meticulous strategy games like Civilization and XCOM, for a game about 1930s race cars. Microprose was enthusiastic, but before development began, they had money problems, and got bought out by toy conglomerate Hasbro, who had much less patience for the extremely nerdy idea Broadsword was in possession of. And while the game was moved forward, it had a troubled development cycle, with a revolving door of producers, all of whom were working different goals. The game released on PC exclusively in Europe, where that sort of old-school race car culture was most fertile. And the response was basically, yeah, kinda neat, with compliments towards the details of the cars and criticism for the sharp slowdown anytime more than one car was on screen. But the interests of PC gamers, especially back in the late 1990s, were much different than the interests of console gamers, and fussy, nerdy motor toy games like Spirit of Speed 1937 very rarely get presented to the broader interests of the living room TV. Case in point, Grand Prix Legends, a game released the year prior to Spirit of Speed, focusing on a recreation of mid to late 60s racing, was very well regarded, but sold in the US on a level that PC Gamer magazine referred to as abysmally poor. That game never received any sort of console release, so a less technically successful version focused on even older cars would not seem to be a prime candidate for a port. But it's not entirely unheard of. I have covered 3 modern F1/IndyCar games on this project so far, and one of them, Monaco Grand Prix, had both psychotically unforgiving controls and a mode where you could play with old-timey cars. Hasbro, primarily a PC-only company, ended up passing on the port rights, which were picked up by Acclaim, but for reasons that I can't quite glean. Acclaim decided to release a Dreamcast port of Spirit of Speed 1937 on June 27, 2000, under the LJN banner. I like to think it's because they were embarrassed by it, but that doesn't make any sense when you could just not release it. But it just leads to the implication that this is a substandard product, something also given credence by its $25 budget release price. Back in my Monaco Grand Prix review, I found that game so ruthless in its controls that I debated the validity of trying to make something so meticulous and exacting under the guise of realism that it stops being fun. And considering that game was generally well regarded, I was really dreading how nightmarish the controls could be for a similar game considered basement terrible. So it was to my surprise that Spirit of Speed 1937's handling is honestly pretty okay. The cars are fussy, sure, but they're generally navigable through the tracks. And I had absolutely no problem guiding them through each level with a minimum of crashing. It handles drastically better than anything in Monaco Grand Prix, especially the aforementioned retro mode. But that does not mean that Spirit of Speed is some sort of underrated hidden gem. The first thing to notice here is that this game is a single-player affair. Well, the very first thing I noticed is that the box is called Spirit of Speed 1937, but the title screen calls it The Spirit of Speed, no year, and that it has some insanely lengthy loading times, like a launch day PS1 game, which is absolutely unforgivable for how drab everything looks here. But yes, this is a one-player game, which is preposterous for a console racing title, especially one with no real story like Grand Theft Auto or whatever. But fits right in with this game's inexplicably somber tone, seemingly determined to make sure you have as little opportunity for fun gaming time as humanly possible. The opening video shows racers losing control and crashing. The manual calls the handling on the cars primitive and begs you to use practice mode, quote, to save frustration against actual opponents. But like most console gamers, I did not read the manual beforehand, and I jumped right into championship mode. And what I discovered after the fact is that without the game telling you any of this, Spirit of Speed is designed to emphasize the shortcomings of each car for specific tracks against other racers, under the guise of realism. So championship mode, where you pick one single car and race all the tracks, is the least user-friendly mode of all. The other racers are basically flawless motor gods. All their cars are tuned to the top specifications, and all their reactions are perfect, because they will get ahead of you immediately. And if you lose sight of them on the track, that's basically the last time you're going to see them. This would be less of a problem if not for the lap times. Each lap of nearly every course in this game averages between 3 and 5 minutes per lap. And the races here run 10 full laps. Every single race is a deep commitment. And nearly every track on the circuit is going to take upwards of 40 minutes of your time. And since the opponents leave you in the dust so quickly, 90 to 95% of this game is just quietly cruising along by yourself, past empty fields and occasional trees. Of course, anytime you do end up near any of the opponents, the game has some profound performance issues, and the dive in frame rate is preposterous for a game where so little is going on. Even funnier, the game has a gas and tire meter that it does not even slightly tell you about. You have to make regular pit stops, and outside of an optional meter on the HUD, which again the game assumes you'll figure out yourself, you will simply run out of gas on the track. The race does not end when you run out of gas, and you cannot leave the vehicle or limp to the pits. There is no game over screen. You simply stop on the track, and you have to sit there until you consciously quit the game. This also occurs when your car overheats, which happens when you amble off the track for any meaningful amount of time, or sometimes for seemingly no reason at all. The car just bursts into flames, and you just have to sit there watching it until you say uncle. There's also no prominent standings, no cutscenes, you barely even know you've finished a race, and the only indication that the championship circuit had been completed was one small pop-up at the end about how I wouldn't be getting asked back next season. There's just no guidance, no style. You're just adrift. I could see an argument being made that this game is not a racing game so much as a simulation of racing history, and that anyone expecting a regular racing game is just misinformed as to what type of experience this is. But that doesn't really hold water when you see the actual product. Other than the explodometer, your car doesn't take any sort of realistic damage. And while you could argue things like a map showing where the other competitors are would be unrealistic because the racers in 1937 wouldn't have known that, they also wouldn't be able to see their gas measured as a colored meter on an optional HUD overlay, or see times and placement floating above their heads to the corner of their eyes. If you're already making small concessions to playability and functionality, you're no longer doing your meticulous racing sim, and there's no excuse for the other basic shit that's missing. At some point, you're just making a bad product. And again, this is a fussy PC sim being judged as a console racing game in the year 2000. These types of games simply didn't exist in these realms. So even the best version of this concept would confuse mainstream living room gamer audiences. And this one comes off as such a flawed, broken, compromised product. It was destined to become something despised for its bad execution of a quirky premise, existing outside of the context in which it was created. What are the limits of the desire for realism in emulation? What is the point of a meticulous simulation if it's recreating something that sucks? What is accuracy worth if the result is something unpleasant to experience? As someone who's watched so many punishingly bad, Z-grade garbage movies that I used to jokingly call myself the cinemasochist, I never got into things like Sharknado, because they were deliberately aiming to make something that resembled bad movies. They were trying to make something that sucked on purpose. And the profound pointlessness of that endeavor always baffled me. But those movies were not only creating something to be bad, but half-assing it. If you're going to commit to something this deliberately alienating, you better go all the way with it. Desert Bus understands this, even if it's doing it to be deliberately provocative. These are singular, unsparing, notable experiences because they commit so wholeheartedly. And Desert Bus has attracted a legacy as a novelty of endurance. Since 2007, there's been an annual stream of it for charity that's raised over $12 million. Spirit of Speed 1937 had a fun idea that by its very nature was always going to be an extremely niche project in the best of circumstances. But with the Hasbro involvement and the rapid switch in production heads, this was already a compromised product to begin with. And to port it to an audience that doesn't have the language to understand what it's nominally going for, and to have that port feel so careless and ragged, to claim that it's being published by a defunct publisher with a hideous reputation, and then sell the game for less than half price. It just comes off like a game that is telling you it sucks, and encouraging you not to buy it. The irony is, with a few creature comforts, this could have been a totally acceptable racing game. If they had added more information about what you're meant to be doing or how to do it, if they had utilized the HUD to tell you things like where the other racers are, if they had allowed a second player, created a two-player option, if they had done anything to make championship mode feel like something you were following along with, if they had done anything to make these tracks visually resemble anything about the 1930s outside of open fields, to give you any personality, any context of the times past cars were worse than. Hell, if nothing else, if they had shortened the lap times to make it so it didn't take me the length of an episode of Law & Order to get through a single race, I'd probably be able to look upon this experience more favorably. Because the only things that feel like they're successfully period accurate here are the things that suck. That the brakes work so poorly, that it's a nightmare of spin-outs and shifting to reverse and getting yourself back on track after a crash, that your car will just sometimes die or explode without seemingly any rhyme or reason. Is this realistic? Maybe. But so much else here isn't. And it certainly is not fun. This is an empty, quiet, lonely game with flat graphics, no style, and endless races. And the massive loading times and enormous performance issues are just completely unforgivable for a game that basically doesn't have anything else going on. It's not even fun to talk about. The endurance isn't even the point. It's simply incidental tedium. And the game does not seem to have a perspective or an idea of what its actual point even is. It seems to be a game made for no one. A release that is not even intended to please a single person in any satisfactory way. This could have been something. And I'd welcome another ambitious idea like this in a heartbeat. Because like I said, I love that sort of delirious period obsession. But Spirit of Speed 1937 ain't it. And this broken, flawed, compromised little thing richly deserves its reputation as one of the worst experiences on the Dreamcast hardware. Huge credit to Cassidy's incredible article on the Bad Game Hall of Fame website for a lot of the details of this history. I'll link that in the comments. Next time, here's 2 more chances to glumly hit stuff with a stick.